Thank you for joining the virtual edition of the Geneva class, Stevens Valley Church, and the continuation of our study of a man called Peter, his life and his teachings. We're going to come to the final session dealing with the life of Peter and answering a question I think everyone seems to be somewhat concerned about. It came up a few weeks ago when a question was asked about whether Peter was the first pope. We dealt with that. But the second part of that related question is Babylon a key word, a symbolic word for Rome? And we're going to deal with that now because of something that Peter wrote. So you might call this the fourth missionary journey of Peter, around the late 50s or early 60s. And we can also call this the Babylonian mission. We know there was a Babylonian mission. We're just not sure what Babylon was. Here's a map of Peter's missionary journeys, and there are very few of them available on the web. Most of them are Paul's journeys. This is Peter's, and we have already dealt with nearly all of this. For instance, if you look down at the bottom right, you see Jerusalem. Of course, Peter's ministry began in Jerusalem. He's the one who spoke on the day of Pentecost and several other things. We notice the several firsts relating to Peter as he takes his position as a leader in the church after 3 years of on-the-job training from Christ and then a transitional period. Also, if you'll look at that same area to the right, you'll see Joppa and Lydda, which were considered a part of Palestine then, and a part, therefore, of his ministry in Judea. Lydda and Joppa are two places where Peter will perform miracles. And then, of course, going to Caesarea, where he will preach the gospel to the first Gentiles. Follow the arrow up to Antioch. We know he was in Antioch. He's there particularly dealing with the question of whether Gentiles could be admitted to the church with or without requiring the Jewish rites and rituals. Now, the other arrows we're not too sure about. I think we can be relatively confident that he did go into what we call, sometimes people call Asia Minor, really was the large province of Anatolia, as the Greeks knew it, and then it was divided up into a number of different provinces under the Romans. And that's the verbiage that Peter will use. He said he's addressing his letter, his first letter, to exiles, to elect people in Cappadocia, Galatia, Pontus, Bithynia, Asia, these that you see on the map. So I would think since he addressed people there that he was in this region. Now, once we cross the Aegean Sea, there's less certainty about Corinth. Paul mentions that there were in Corinth people who identified with Peter, and so maybe Peter was there in Corinth. Now, going still farther and following the map to the left side is Rome. We're not sure that he crossed the Adriatic Sea and went to Rome. So we're going to examine that because of something he wrote. And that in the first letter, we'll be looking at the first letter beginning next week, Lord willing. But in the 5th chapter, 12th through 14th verses, we read Peter saying that the letter is by Silvanus, a faithful brother, as I regard him. I've written briefly to you, exhorting and declaring that this is the true grace of God. Stand firm in it. She who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does Mark, my son. Greet one another with the kiss of love. Now, the main question that we want to deal with is, what does he mean by Babylon? Is he talking about the literal Babylon in Mesopotamia, or is he talking about Babylon as a metaphorical expression, a symbolic description of the city of Rome? We don't know that. We're going to look at the for and against being the city of Rome. But also in this same passage, we've got some other things that do draw our attention. For instance, she who is with him, and she's likewise chosen, therefore she's elect. She's with Peter in Babylon, and she sends greetings to these people who obviously are in Anatolia, in those provinces we looked at a moment ago. And along with Peter and this woman, we have Mark. It would be John Mark, the author of the first gospel. And there is considerable speculation, I think that a basis for it, that Peter was the source of information about Jesus for Mark, who wrote that first gospel, because Mark is younger. He was not one of the apostles, but the church met in the house of his mother, Mary. So Mark was along also. Now, there is some thought that maybe the lady was Peter's wife. We do know that he was married, he had a mother-in-law, so that's quite possible. Other than that, we don't know for sure, but it is interesting just to see what Peter wrote. And obviously, these people who are in his audience, recipients of his letter, would know that. So let's divide this up now into the case for Peter being in Rome and the case for Peter not being in Rome. So first of all, we'll look at the situation with Babylon being identified as a city of Rome. And by the way, it is also identified as the society of the world, the evil society in commentaries. But we'll consider just Rome, the city, and Babylon, the city. Now, in that first epistle, Peter says that he was writing from Babylon. It has been common to assume that Peter was writing from Rome, and there are a few reasons for this. Now, I'm going to give you reasons that I found in writing on the internet. Unfortunately, the sources that I found, although they were Christian sources from different Christian ministries, they were not signed, so I can't tell you exactly who wrote these things. We'll consider them and critically examine them. So here are the reasons to believe that Peter was in Rome and that he used the word Babylon to describe Rome. The literal city of Babylon was a city in decline at that time, mostly unpopulated during the first century. And we do know that John used the name Babylon symbolically, apparently for Rome, in the book of Revelation. The commentator Hendrickson is the one who points out that he believes it has a wider application generally to the evil worldly society. Third point, there is pretty good reason to believe that Peter died in Rome. And we'll look at that as we go along. I would not say pretty good reason. I would say there is a tradition, and that tradition is very strong. So this fifth missionary journey of Peter to Rome, and the question is, did it really exist, or was this journey to the city of Babylon? Back again to our editorial comment from the internet. The Roman Catholic Church has long identified Peter as its patron saint, seeing him as their founder. While it is pretty clear from the New Testament that Peter did not found the church in Rome, it is certainly quite reasonable to think he died there. There seems to be solid documentation supporting that he was martyred and decent support that his death happened in Rome. It is hard to see whether he came to Rome through mission work or in chains. Either way, the story of Peter appears to end as does Paul. The statements made in that particular paragraph I do not regard as being entirely accurate. Solid documentation and reasonable and so forth. We have to be very careful about making these conclusions. Then coming to the next statement, looking at these 5 missionary journeys, we see the progress of the church from Jerusalem to Samaria to Judea, to the Hellenized world, to Parthia, and finally to Rome. Again, I would question the last statement. It is a great way of showing the growth of the church. This, of course, does not undermine the structure of the book of Acts. It, however, is a reminder that history is the connection of moments, and one has the ability to connect many different moments. There is not a history of the early church. There are many, many histories of the early church. And now the same editor comments on the death of Peter. He says, little is known what happens to Peter in the later portion of the book of Acts. Some scholars base what they know on writings of early historians that include Tertullian, Origen, and even Flavius Josephus. let me stop for a moment. I do intend to be somewhat critical of these statements. I think we should examine them critically. Tertullian and Origen were not historians. Tertullian and Origen were early theologians in the church. And he makes a statement, even Flavius Josephus. That is not true. Josephus never mentions Peter or any of the apostles. So those cannot be sources for what happened to Peter. So continuing to read, Paul, on the other hand, we have accounts, both biblical and historical, of his arrival and death in Rome. Chances are both men arrived and lived in the city around the same time under the rule of the Emperor Nero. His last statement, again, is speculation. I am not happy with the term chances are. I really have much more certainty. Now, the next paragraph, it has been said, and that's another caution, a flag that is waved when we see has been said, that the approximate time of the death of Peter was during the time of the great fire in Rome, when Nero blamed the Christians living in the city for the tragic event. This was in AD 64. The manner in which he died continues to be debated to this day. Tradition has it, based on late 1st, early 2nd century historic writings, that Peter was the first pope and that he died by crucifixion upside down. According to these accounts, he did not consider himself worthy to die in the same manner as Jesus did. Now, the last paragraph here, I think, can really endorse. Please remember, Peter was a Jew, not a Roman. Paul was a Roman by birth and a Jew by lineage. You see the difference? The one thing both men had in common was their passion and commitment to their calling to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. They both believed that their death brought them in the presence of God immediately. And again, I comment that Josephus never mentioned Peter or any of the other apostles. Now, let's go to a passage in the Bible. This is in the book of John, the Gospel of John, chapter 21, verses 18 through 19. And Jesus is here speaking to Peter. He is walking with Peter. John is walking behind. A very monumental, very interesting conversation. But he says to Peter, the Lord says to Peter, "Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, "Follow me." Interesting that John wrote those words at the end of the 1st century, many years after Peter's death. Now, would he be an old man at the time of the fire? Peter would have been in his 60s. He probably been about 65 during the Neronian persecution, 65 to 68 or so. Now, this fact could support the idea of his being in Rome and dying in Rome during the persecution, if you consider that his age then would have been considered old. Now, there were people who lived much longer. For instance, Polycarp, who was in his 80s when he was martyred. So was Peter ever in Rome. The Roman Catholic Church obviously has a vested interest in Peter as the first pope and a martyr in the city of Rome. And thus all Catholic scholars will answer that he was there. Many of the early theologians agree with this interpretation, but biblical evidence is lacking. Peter did write, as we've said so far in this study today, Peter wrote his first epistle from Babylon. Babylon obviously had a reference to the center of worldliness and perhaps a reference to the city of Rome, perhaps. So Peter may be using Babylon as a coded symbol of Rome. Now let's look at the other side of it. This is a case for Peter never being in Rome, which means we're going to identify Babylon as literal Babylon in Mesopotamia. And understand it could be either way, but we're trying to say what is the more evidence and logical conclusion to reach. Now, in Peter's letter, and we'll see this as we examine the letters later, all other references in his letter are to literal cities or literal provinces, literal areas, literal nations, and he does not use symbolic language. Second point, Peter was the apostle to the Jews. Now, there were Jews in Rome. There were, in fact, 7 synagogues of Jews, but those Jews had been evangelized. We know that from the Bible because in the last chapter of the book of Acts, Luke describes Paul as preaching to the Jews in Rome. However, Babylon, the literal Babylon, was a major center of Judaism at this time, the Ashkenazi Jews in particular. It continued to be an even greater center of Judaism after the fall of Jerusalem. And Peter was the apostle to the Jews, Paul to the Gentiles. This map shows the proximity of Babylonia and Babylon to Palestine and Jerusalem. You see this kind of an arc that forms around the Arabian desert. Desert, of course, is not a place where habitation can occur. And so you do find cities in the Fertile Crescent and the growth of crops as well. So it could sustain population. And the very beginning of civilization is in Sumer, which is at the far right in this map, the bottom part. And you see cities like Ur, Eridu, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur. And then you see Babylon. That's the literal Babylon. The general area is Babylonia because it was at one time a great empire. And so that gives you an idea of the proximity of Babylonia to Palestine. And you know that obviously Rome is a far distance from Palestine. Now let's go to the Bible. What does the Bible say about Babylon? Well, the first teaching regarding Babylon is in the prophecy of Isaiah. And Isaiah prophesied in the 8th century BC, and Babylon really was not much of anything at that point. Babylon became a great city and an empire in the 7th century. So actually, Isaiah has prophesied the end of Babylon before Babylon actually really began. And of course, inspiration is involved here. In Isaiah 13, verse 19, Isaiah writes, "And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them." Isaiah 14:22, "I will rise up against them, declares the Lord of hosts, and will cut off from Babylon name and remnant, descendants and posterity, declares the Lord, and I will make it a possession of the hedgehog and pools of water." Isaiah 21:9, "And behold, here come riders, horsemen in pairs. And he answered, Fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all the carved images of her gods he has shattered to the ground." Now let's turn to Babylon in the New Testament in the book of Revelation. Revelation 18, and there's no doubt this is symbolic. "After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice," and please notice as I read through this, the similarity to the prophecy in Isaiah. "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She's become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living." Now let's go to an editorial comment. Actually, this is a continuation of the first editorial comment. And in this, we'll see that the editor did believe that there was an argument for literal Rome. But he says there are good reasons to think that Babylon did not refer to Rome here. And so he gives the other side of it as well. One, Babylon may have been a dying city, but the term was used more broadly in the region as well as in the Hebrew Bible. Repeatedly, Jews called Mesopotamia Babel. Secondly, John may have used Babylon symbolically for Rome, but as far as we know, no one used the term that was prior to Revelation. In other words, what he's saying is you don't find Babylon used symbolically for Rome any place in the Bible prior to John's usage in the book of Revelation. And there would certainly agree that it would include Rome. Now, third point, Peter finishing his ministry in no way is in conflict with him spending time in the region of Babylon, of literal Babylon. More positively, Peter was described as the apostle to the Jews. The largest Jewish population was in the region around literal Babylon. For example, one of the two Talmuds was the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud Bavli. I think that's the strongest argument. And five, there has been a tendency in Western scholarship to focus on the spread of Christianity westward, that is into Europe and northward. However, much of the growth of the early church, and people do not recognize this, they're not really cognizant of it, much of the growth of the early church was eastward and beyond the borders of the Roman, later Byzantine Empire. This preference may have led to a rather doubtful interpretation. Obviously, I can't say for sure that Peter went to the region of Babel or Babylon, but if Peter is correctly understood as the apostle to the Jews, it begs the question why he would not go there, that is to the Jews. The reference in 1 Peter seems to be a strong support of the idea that he did go there prior to his last journey. So let's look at this argument based on the division of work. And I think this is a part of God's plan to assign to these apostles certain areas to preach the gospel. Even Paul will say that I wanted to preach in a place where I would not be usurping somebody else's territory, in other words. So let's look at Galatians 2. After 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up because of a revelation and set before them, though privately, before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure that I was not running or had not run in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a false brother brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring us into slavery, in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. And from those who seem to be influential, they were, makes no difference to me, God shows no partiality, those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, that is the Gentiles, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, the Jews. For he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas, that's Peter, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Only they ask us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. It makes sense to me that Peter would make sure that he would go to a center of Jewish population much larger than that in Rome, in literal Babylon, and preach the gospel. There is no doubt about Peter's primacy, however, and we talked about this in an earlier study. The Roman Church has defined the role of Peter as the Bishop of Rome and the first Pope. And the basis for the claim of the primacy of Peter is in Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 to 20. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter, replied, Peter's always the first to reply, it seems like. Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, Simon son of John, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. And for those of you who want the more complete analysis of this case, of this matter of whether Peter was the first pope, though that class lesson has been recorded, is available on YouTube on the Stevens Valley site. Now, it is true, the early church did accept Peter's role as chief among the apostles due to his vocalizing the doctrines and practices of the church, being the first in so many instances, and the fact that even Christ will name him first in a list of apostles. But there is no biblical evidence for the office of supreme authority as defined by the Roman office of the papacy. The Eastern Church never accepted the concept of the papacy. Now, the imperial tradition of Rome, which again is discussed in the earlier class, may have influenced the development of the hierarchy. So the question still remains, why and how did the Bishop of Rome claim authority over the whole church? Something that no other bishop or prelate of the church anywhere did. Now, there is a complete absence of biblical evidence of the presence of Peter in the city of Rome. Now, Paul does not include Peter in the rather comprehensive list of Christian brothers and sisters in Rome to whom he sends greetings. That's in the 16th chapter of the letter to the Romans. The church had already been established in Rome, and if Peter was the head of the church and had established the church there, he would certainly be greeted along with the other saints. He's not listed at all. Additionally, Luke does not mention Peter in the history recorded in the book of Acts. And there is no reliable historical or theological text concerning Peter in Rome. Yes, there are theologians, particularly in the 2nd and 3rd century, that will advance the idea of the primacy of Peter and identify him with Rome, but not earlier. However, tradition strongly suggests Peter's presence and primacy in Rome, no doubt about that. Many relics have been collected purporting to belong to Peter and his ministry in Rome. I'm thinking of the chains that bound Peter supposedly that are on display in St. Peter in Chains Church in Rome. Again, we cannot discount tradition. There's some basis in tradition, but we cannot say that he was there. We cannot say with a definity. Now, Jesus did predict that Peter would die controlled by others. That does fit into the possibility of his being imprisoned in Rome, but under people's control elsewhere are also possible. Now, the first references to Peter in Rome, very interesting, said that you'll not find it in Josephus, and not find it in early historians like Tacitus and Suetonius. And here is a quote from a professor, Nicola Denzi Lewis of Brown University Religious Studies. Peter has been associated with Rome for nearly 2,000 years. The earliest testimony to the Apostle Peter's presence in Rome is a letter from a Christian deacon named Gaius, writing probably toward the end of the 2nd century, Common Era or AD, around 170 or 180. Gaius tells about the wondrous things in Rome, including something called Atropion, where Peter established a church. In fact, the church, the Roman Catholic Church, at the site where St. Peter's Basilica is today. There is no solid evidence, textual or even archaeological, that Peter died in Rome. But starting around the end of the 2nd century, Christian pilgrims went to see Peter's Tropion. But a tropion is not a tomb. The word itself is very unusual. It's sometimes translated as trophy, It means something like a war memorial or a cenotaph, an empty grave. It is not the word used in the Roman Empire for a burial place. Yet this spot, which was originally in the middle of an ancient cemetery, was quickly understood as the place where Peter was buried. Conclusion. In spite of the fact that there is a strong tradition that Peter, that says Paul, I'm sorry, that Peter was in Rome and died there under Nero, there is insufficient evidence from historians to support that tradition. The tradition may be accurate, it can be, or it may be only apocryphal. The accuracy of the tradition neither adds nor detracts from the biblical account and the undoubted importance of the Apostle Peter. And with this, we will leave our study of the life of Peter, and Lord willing, next week we'll turn to the teachings of Peter in his first letter. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God our Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all. Thank you for your listening to this series.